At Starbound, we tell stories the human way, not with artificial voices or AI slop. In the end, what's HFY without humanity? Subscribe to keep it this way. My name's Aurum. Let's begin. Buck Riley had survived pirate attacks, engine failures, and corporate audits, but he was fairly certain Ambassador Corrin's lecture on procedural minutia was going to be the death of him. Just not this literally. One minute, he was in the plush, climate-controlled cabin of the diplomatic skimmer Aethel's Pride, listening to Ambassador Nadalia Kasumi deliver a meticulously condescending lecture on the procedural inadequacies of his pre-flight safety check. The skimmer's interior was a study in her people's aesthetic. Cool gray surfaces, seats of woven metallic fiber that adjusted to the occupant's posture, and soft, indirect lighting. It was a sterile, orderly environment designed to insulate its occupants from the harsh realities of the universe.
Your checklist, item 14 Delta, concerning the manual override for the inertial dampeners,
the ambassador was saying, her voice a placid, musical chime that somehow made her words cut deeper.
You merely initialed it. Aethel regulations require a full signature, time-stamped, with the subnotation confirming a cross-check against the ship's internal chronometer. It is this casual approach, Mr. Riley, that precipitates calamity.
She smoothed a non-existent wrinkle on her immaculate silver robes, a garment that seemed to repel the very concept of dust. Outside the reinforced viewport, the red sands of Skarath stretched to a horizon that shimmered under the heat of a bloated, unforgiving sun. It was a landscape of stark, brutal beauty, a world of powdered iron oxide and wind-carved mesas that looked like the bones of dead gods. The heat radiating off the sand was so intense it distorted the air, making the distant rock formations writhe and twist. The next minute, that casual approach was the only thing keeping them from becoming a crater. Alarms shrieked a symphony of disaster, a discordant choir of synthesized voices screaming about core breaches, flight computer failures, and imminent, rapid, unplanned deceleration. The armored skimmer, a vehicle designed for smooth, dignified travel, performed a gymnastics routine it was never designed for. The only procedure that mattered was don't die. Inside the bucking metal coffin, sparks rained down from the ceiling like malevolent fireflies. Torque, the Aethel tech officer, was having a full-blown meltdown over his console. The calm, gray surfaces were now strobing with angry red alerts. "Damn it!" he shrieked, his voice cracking. His slender fingers danced across the dark screen, keying in diagnostic commands, swiping through error logs, and attempting to isolate the cascading failures that bloomed like red flowers of death across his interface. "The core drive is fried. The damage signature is clean. All safeties tripped at once. A system-wide shutdown. An external kill switch must have been triggered. Report!" Ambassador Kasumi's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and imperious. Her placid demeanor had vanished, replaced by the hardened authority of her station. She was braced against the bulkhead, her robes still pristine, her body held rigid against the violent lurching of the craft. She looked as though she was about to file a strongly worded complaint with the universe. Beside her, Beeves, the junior attaché and resident historian, was the color of old parchment. He gripped his seat, his knuckles white, his eyes wide with a terror that was almost academic in its intensity. He stared out the reinforced viewport, his mouth a perfect O of horrified fascination. "By the founders, look at the size of it!" Buck, having already unstrapped himself and moved to the center of the cabin for a lower center of gravity, followed his gaze. Outside, framed by the cracked viewport, was a mountain of jagged, rust-colored bioceramic plating and bone. It rose from the red sands like a nightmare given form, a Scarathian sand leviathan. Its head, a massive sledgehammer of solid bone designed to pulverize rock, dwarfed their crippled skimmer. Two beady black eyes, ancient and devoid of anything but hunger, fixed on them. The creature was so large it blotted out the sun, casting them into a sudden, terrifying twilight. The skimmer hit the ground with a sound of tearing metal and shattered glass. It plowed a deep furrow in the sand before coming to a groaning, final stop, tilted at a sickening angle. Buck calmly ejected the nearly spent power cell from his plasma rifle and slapped a fresh one home. The weapon hummed with renewed purpose. He cracked his knuckles, a sound that seemed offensively casual in the face of their imminent demise. His movements were deliberate, unhurried, the actions of a man who had accepted the situation and was already working the problem. He turned to the terrified Aethel. "All right, new plan." He gave the monster outside a thoughtful look, his eyes scanning its anatomy with a butcher's appraisal. "Wonder if this thing's edible."
Your plan is suicide,
Kasumi snapped, her voice tight with a fury that barely masked her fear. Her entire life had been governed by logic, by procedure, by the predictable actions of civilized beings. This human, this throwback, operated on an axiom she could not comprehend. The Leviathan punctuated her statement by smashing its head against the skimmer's hull. The entire vehicle groaned, metal shrieking as it was driven deeper into the sand. The already cracked viewport spiderwebbed into a mosaic of fractures. Red emergency lights bathed the cabin in a hellish glow. "My current plan is to not get pulped inside this tin can," Buck retorted, yanking open a storage locker and rummaging inside. "Your plan appears to be dying with dignity. I'm not a big fan of dignity." He pulled out a heavy satchel stenciled with warnings for seismic shaping charges.
We must calculate escape vectors. Torque, deploy the aft propulsion lift,
Kasumi commanded, falling back on the familiar cadence of command and technology.
The what?
Torque wailed, his composure completely gone.
Ambassador, the power core is a paperweight. The only thing I can deploy is a panicked scream.
Buck slung the satchel over his shoulder. It was heavy, solid, reassuring. He's got that covered. Now, stay here and try not to get eaten. He didn't wait for an argument. He slammed his boot against the emergency release on the main hatch. With a hiss of depressurized air, it blew outwards, landing in the sand with a dull thud. The dry, furnace-hot air of Skarath flooded the cabin, carrying the scent of baked stone and alien dust.
You are a madman!
Kasumi yelled after him. And you're about to be monster food, he shouted back, already sprinting across the sand, his boots kicking up clouds of red powder. The Leviathan's head reared back, its cavernous maw opening to reveal rows of grinding plates instead of teeth. It was a creature designed to crush, not to bite. It moved with the inexorable force of a glacier, a geological event more than a living thing. Buck ran straight at it. To the Aethel watching from the wreck, it was an act of pure, unadulterated audacity. To Buck, it was a risk calculated in the split seconds he had to live. The monster was big, which meant it was powerful. It also meant it had exploitable weaknesses. As its massive head descended again, aiming to turn him into a red smear on the sand, Buck saw his opening. The creature's lower jaw was studded with thick, bony protrusions, like giant molars on the outside of its mouth, designed for gripping and cracking large rock formations. That external structure meant the beast could never press its head completely flat against the ground. There was a gap, a small, insane, ridiculously dangerous gap. It was just enough. Buck went down on his back, sliding on the slick, cooling metal of the satchel right under the creature's immense, grinding jaw. For a horrifying second, his world was nothing but the underside of the beast, a landscape of thick, plated flesh, alien anatomy, and the grinding sound of bone on sand. The stench was overwhelming, a mix of hot rock and rotting meat. He found what he was looking for, a nexus of softer, pulsating tissue where the neck met the jaw, a vulnerable spot he'd clocked in the first 30 seconds of the attack. He aimed the charges, his fingers moving with an unconscious swiftness born from 1,000 repetitions. They found the arming sequence, toggled the magnetic clamps, and set the timer in 3 precise, fluid motions. The clamps locked onto the creature's hide with a solid thunk. He set the timer for 3 seconds. 3. He pushed off with his feet, propelling himself backward through the sand. 2. He rolled, scrambling away from the epicenter, his muscles screaming with effort. 1. The world dissolved into white light and a sound that was felt more than heard. A deep, resonant crunch that vibrated through the sand and up his spine. The shaped charge did its job, focusing all its energy into a single, penetrating point. Buck was thrown clear, tumbling head over heels. He landed hard, the air knocked from his lungs. When he looked up, gasping for breath, the sand leviathan was in its death throes. It thrashed wildly, a gargantuan, unholy screech tearing from its ruined throat, a sound that clawed at the ears. Then, with a final, earth-shaking tremor, it collapsed, its colossal head hitting the sand with a boom that shook the very bedrock of the desert. Silence descended, broken only by the howling of the wind and the frantic, disbelieving gasps coming from the wrecked skimmer. Buck got to his feet, brushed the red dust off his pants, and gave the aliens a thumbs up. They just stared, their refined, aristocratic faces a perfect picture of horrified awe. The victory lap lasted approximately 45 seconds, until the sky began to fester. The pale blue of the Scarath noon turned a sickly, jaundiced yellow. A low hum, barely audible at first, began to build in intensity, vibrating in their teeth. It quickly escalated into a deafening, high-pitched shriek as if the planet itself was screaming. Torque stumbled out of the skimmer, his eyes glued to a handheld data tablet he managed to salvage. The screen flashed with a single ominous warning in bold galactic standard. "Oh, no," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Oh, this is monumentally not good." "What is it, Sparky?" Buck asked, already scanning the horizon. The wind was picking up, whipping sand into stinging projectiles that pelted his face. A dark line was visible on the horizon, a smudge of brown that was growing with terrifying speed.
"Cataclysmic grade particle storm inbound,"
Torque read, his voice rising in panic.
"Winds exceeding 900 kilometers per hour. High metallic particle count. Orbital bombardment equivalency. Impact estimate."
He swallowed hard.
9 minutes.
9 minutes until what? Beeves asked, his academic curiosity warring with primal terror.
"Until the landscape is sandblasted down to the mantle,"
Torque whimpered.
"Until we are anatomically disassembled on a molecular level."
The wind was a physical force now, leaning on them, trying to push them over. The air was thick with flying grit that felt like tiny glass shards against their skin. The very ground seemed to vibrate with the coming onslaught.
"Deploy the emergency omni-field generator,"
Kasumi commanded, her voice cutting through the rising gale. She had regained her composure, her mind immediately locking onto the technological solution. Procedure. There was always a device for any given apocalypse. Torque jolted into action, fumbled with a panel on the skimmer's exterior. A tripod-mounted device telescoped out, and with a surge of auxiliary power, a dome of hexagonal energy fields that warped the air like a heat haze crackled to life around them, enclosing the wreck and a small patch of desert. The roar of the wind immediately lessened, though the dome hummed ominously under the strain.
"It's rated to withstand micrometeorite bombardment,"
Torque said, a touch of his usual smugness returning.
"The storm's kinetic energy will be evenly dispersed across the field grid."
Buck just scoffed. The sound was full of derision. He was already at the dead Leviathan, his plasma rifle out again. He'd adjusted the output to a low-intensity, high-heat beam, turning it into a superheated cutting tool. He began carving into the thick, bony plate of the monster's skull, ignoring the three Aethel huddled under their technological marvel. Gore and bone dust steamed and hissed as he worked.
"Riley! What in the name of cosmic insanity are you doing?"
Kasumi shouted, her voice muffled by the energy field and the wind.
"Get under the shield!"
Buck paused his work, turning to face them. He was silhouetted against the dying sky, his face splattered with the dark, viscous fluid that passed for the Leviathan's blood. He looked like some ancient butcher god. "That thing's a light bulb in a hurricane, Specs," he yelled back, gesturing with his rifle at their generator. "Your magic bubble is built to stop tiny things moving really fast. This storm is 1 billion tons of sand moving relatively slow. It's about kinetic energy, not velocity." He slapped the creature's immense skull. The bone rang like ceramic. "This is designed by millions of years to evolution to diffuse that energy. The charge I used was a shaped charge designed to penetrate a specific point. Different tools for different jobs. You can stand there and trust the lowest bidder who built your magic bubble, or you can get your pampered asses in here before you become a permanent part of the landscape. Your choice." He turned back to his work, slicing out a large enough section of bone to create an opening. The wind was a solid wall now, and the sand it carried was beginning to score visible lines across the surface of the energy field. The storm hit not as a weather front, but as a physical impact. It was like being struck by a planet. The shriek became a solid, mind-numbing roar that blotted out all other sound. The omnifield, Torque's pride and joy, flickered violently. The hexagonal pattern strobed like a failing light fixture.
"What's happening?"
Beeves yelled, though no one could hear him.
"The metallic particulates!"
Torque screamed, his eyes wide with terror as he watched his diagnostic tablet.
"They're creating a cascade short in the emitter grid. The field can't stabilize."
Kasumi watched, her faith in technology warring with the terrifying reality before her. The dome, their bastion of civilization against the raw fury of nature, was visibly degrading, turning translucent and weak. Then, with a sound like a giant tearing a sheet of fabric, the omnifield shattered. The full force of the storm slammed into them. It was a physical blow, a torrent of sand and wind that felt solid. Torque was knocked off his feet. Beeves cried out as the superheated, razor-sharp sand scoured his exposed skin. Buck saw their hesitation, the stunned disbelief on their faces. There was no time for persuasion. He charged back towards them, leaning into the wind like he was wading through a river. He grabbed Ambassador Kasumi by the arm of her ridiculously expensive robe. She was surprisingly light. "No time to argue!" He bellowed directly into her ear. He began to physically haul her towards the grisly opening he'd carved in the Leviathan's skull. "This thing's skull evolved for millions of years to survive this crap!" he roared, dragging her struggling form across the sand. "Its bone lattice is designed to diffuse kinetic energy. Our tin can was built by the cheapest contractor in the sector. Move!" Beeves, seeing the logic in Buck's desperate screaming, scrambled after them, shielding his face. A protesting, terrified Torque was practically blown along in their wake. Buck shoved Kasumi through the opening into the gore-slicked cavity of the beast's skull. then bundled Beeves and Torque in after her. He dove in last, just as the full cataclysmic force of the storm descended. They heard the sound of their high-tech skimmer and the omnifield generator being torn apart, the shriek of rending metal, a brief, violent crescendo before it was swallowed by the storm's eternal roar. Inside the bone, the sound was a deafening, soul-shaking drone. The entire skull vibrated as if it were a bell being struck by 1,000 hammers a second. The air was thick with the coppery smell of alien blood, the acrid stink of his cutter superheating the air, and a deep, musky odor like old stone and reptile. Their boots squelched with gore, which trickled down the walls and made a small river of blood that flowed toward the opening. But they were alive. They were sheltered. The joke of a shelter had saved them, while their marvel of technology had been shredded into atoms. Pressed together in the dark, gory cavity, the three Aethel finally understood. Buck wasn't a madman. He was a survivor. The silence, when it finally came, was more jarring than the storm. It was a thick, heavy blanket that settled over the ruined landscape. After hours of constant, deafening noise, the sudden absence of it left their ears ringing. Buck pushed aside the slab of bone he'd used to partially block the entrance. A shaft of crimson light from the Skarath dawn cut through the gloom, illuminating the interior of their macabre sanctuary. Kasumi, Beeves, and Torque were huddled together, covered in drying alien ichor, looking like survivors of some bizarre sacrificial ritual. Outside, the world had been remade. The dunes had shifted, their contours smoothed and reformed. Of their armored skimmer, nothing remained but a few twisted, sand-scoured parts of metal poking from a newly formed drift. All their equipment, their supplies, their link to civilization, gone, wiped clean from the face of the planet. Buck took a deep breath of the cool, post-storm air. Well, nobody died. I call that a win. He hopped down from the skull and immediately went to work. He unslung his plasma rifle, set it back to a cutting beam, and began carving thick purplish stakes from the Leviathan's flank. Beeves, ever the scholar, was the first to emerge, blinking in the new light. He watched Buck with a mixture of fascination and queasiness. "What are you doing now?" "Procuring breakfast," Buck said without looking up. "And lunch, and dinner. This big fella's gonna be our rations, our water source, and our toolkit for the foreseeable future." He gestured with the rifle towards a series of large, bladder-like organs visible within the beast's opened torso. "Those sacks are full of filtered fluid. Probably tastes like battery acid, but it won't kill us. Probably." While Beeves was cautiously absorbing this lesson in extreme foraging, Torque was having another crisis. He was obsessively sifting through the skimmer wreckage, muttering to himself.
Main comms array vaporized, long-range scanner atomized, life support recycler. It's a modern art sculpture now.
He was a man whose entire identity was built on technology, and his world had just been unbuilt. But then, his technician's brain, unable to remain idle, took over. He found a frayed length of power conduit, its insulation stripped away by the storm. He tested its strength, but it crumbled in his fingers. He cursed. Then his eyes fell upon the Leviathan's corpse, where Buck was effortlessly peeling away a long, fibrous tendon as thick as his arm. Torque stared at the glistening sinew, his expression one of profound inner conflict. He looked at the useless, frayed cable in his hand, then back at the biological material.
Theoretically,
he muttered, the words tasting like ash in his mouth.
The molecular tensile strength of that sinew is exponentially superior to a standard polymer conductor cable. If I could braid it.
He let the worthless wire drop into the sand. With a look of utter self-loathing, the high-tech officer trudged over to the dead monster and began to begrudgingly harvest a length of its gut, unable to deny the simple, brutal superiority of the material at hand. It was while Torque was attempting to fashion a new strap for his data tablet out of cured leviathan hide that he found it. The tablet, its case now a grotesque patchwork of metal and organic tissue, had picked up a faint, repeating signal.
I am getting something,
he announced, his voice a strange mix of excitement and revulsion.
A locator beacon, subdermal frequency, military grade. It belongs to someone else.
The signal was weak, but it was close. They traced it to a large, twisted plate of hull armor, half buried in the sand. Working together, they managed to pry it up. Beneath it, nestled in a small crater, was a heavily armored, self-powered message beacon. It was sleek, black, and bore the unmistakable emblem of the Argent conglomerate. It had clearly been planted. Buck knelt, his expression grim. This was it, the proof. He wiped a grimy hand across the activation panel. With a soft chime, the beacon hummed to life, projecting a holographic image into the air above it. The face that appeared was sharp, angular, and utterly devoid of warmth. It belonged to Executor Mayron, a Drycar whose species was synonymous with predatory cunning. His voice was a flat, chilling monotone. Executor Mayron, Contract 819 fulfilled. Target Kasumi Convoy. Method System Failure. Scarathian Predation. Class 5 Storm Convergence. Asset Termination confirmed. Awaiting payment validation. Secondary team en route for physical confirmation as per contingency. The message looped, a cold, professional report. The line went dead, the hologram vanishing, leaving them in the silent, red desert. The truth landed on them with the force of the sandstorm.
Contract 819. They gave our assassination a number,
Kasumi whispered, her voice a mixture of ice and fire.
System failure, Scarathian predation, storm convergence,
Torque recited, his technical mind piecing it together.
A sequence of events. They didn't just sabotage us, they weaponized the entire planet against us.
Buck spat into the red sand. Secondary team. That means they're still coming. They intend to be thorough. The truth of their situation settled in. They were prey. Their journey to the Rust Well was a pilgrimage through hell. The trail Buck found was less a path and more a suggestion, a faint discoloration in the sand that only his trained eye could follow. They walked under a sun that baked the very air they breathed. Buck pushed them relentlessly. He taught them how to walk on the shifting dunes to conserve energy, how to read the sun's position, how to wrap their faces in strips of leviathan hide to protect from the grit. He showed Beeves how to use a sharpened shard of the beast's plating to dig for pulpy, water-storing tubers. He even got Torque to admit that a bladder made from a monster's stomach was a remarkably functional, if disgusting, canteen. Kasumi said little, but her transformation was the most profound. She stopped issuing orders and started asking questions. She learned to ration her water, to ignore the blisters on her feet, to see the world not as a backdrop for her existence, but as an active participant that had to be outsmarted. The Rust Well was less an oasis and more a smear of corrosion on the horizon, It was a handful of prefabricated buildings huddled around a deep-bore well, a desolate trading post for scavengers, nomads, and other lost causes. It was also, unfortunately, an obvious destination. Mayron's enforcers were waiting. They were a hired pack of brutish brask, hulking bipeds who favored heavy-bore slug throwers. The ambush was clumsy but brutal. A hail of projectiles ripped through the air, chewing up the sand around them. "Down!" Buck yelled, shoving Kasumi behind the rusting husk of an ancient landcrawler. There was no room for strategy, only chaos. Buck moved with a fluid, purposeful motion that was terrifying to behold. He'd fashioned a long, wickedly sharp spear from one of the Leviathan's ribs and carried a brace of bioceramic plates, their edges honed to razors. He hurled one of the plates like a discus. It spun through the air and embedded itself in the throat of a brask who was trying to flank them. The creature went down with a wet gurgle. "Fascinating!" Beeves shouted from his hiding spot, his academic mind kicking into overdrive. "The primary ocular cluster is asymmetrical, a vestigial trait from their homeworld's dominant predator. Their left side presents a significant vulnerability." "Aim for the left," Kasumi relayed, her voice the sharp, clear tone of a commander. She pointed a trembling finger that held its aim. "Torque, can you do something about that one?" Torque, who was cowering behind a pile of junk, looked at the damaged power cell he'd been tinkering with. He'd managed to rig it to a simple detonator switch using braided Leviathan sinew. "It might overload. It might do nothing. It might just fizzle." "Do it," Kasumi ordered. With a yelp, Torque tossed the device. It arced through the air and landed near a brask reloading his weapon. The power cell, deprived of all its safety regulators, went critical. It didn't explode. It discharged its entire energy reserve in a single, blinding flash of white light and a deafening sonic crack. The brask screamed, dropping his weapon and clawing at his ruined eyes. In that moment of chaos, Buck saw their chance. A dilapidated, multi-level sand barge was parked near the well, its cargo bay door invitingly open. "The barge! Move!" They scrambled for it, a desperate, running firefight. Buck planted his rib spear in the chest of the last brask blocking their path, vaulted over the twitching body, and helped haul the others aboard. They sealed the door just as a fresh volley of shots hammered against the hull. The rust well disappeared behind them in a cloud of kicked-up dust. They were alive. They were running. And for the first time, they had fought back as a team. Port Scion was a sprawling, chaotic stain on the planet's surface. A city of rusting metal, flickering neon, and a million desperate souls. It was the perfect place to get lost, and the perfect place to get caught. They ditched the sand barge on the outskirts and slipped into the teeming crowds. They found refuge in a grimy, back-alley noodle bar, the air thick with the smell of cheap synth broth and recycled air. Huddled in a dark booth, the argument began.
"We need to find a secure, Concordat-backed comm station,"
Kasumi insisted, her voice a low, urgent whisper.
"We transmit the data slate, the recording of Mayron's report, everything. We expose them."
"And how do we get to this magic comm station, boss?" Buck countered, using his new, grudgingly respectful nickname for her. "We walk up to the front door? Mayron will have every official channel flagged. The second your credentials pop up, his goons will be on us in minutes. We need to disappear. Buy a ticket on some rust bucket freighter heading for the outer rim, lay low, and plan our next move from somewhere they aren't looking."
"Running away is a coward's solution, Riley,"
she hissed. "Staying is a dead man's solution, Kasumi," he shot back. As they debated, their voices rising, Kasumi suddenly held up a hand, silencing them. Her eyes looked past Buck, focusing on the street outside, visible through the greasy window. Her attention was not on the crowd, however. She was looking at their distorted reflections in the polished chrome of a parked vehicle across the way.
"That's God,"
she whispered, her eyes narrowed in concentration. It was a Port Authority officer, standing on a street corner, looking bored, but his attention was elsewhere.
"His gaze ignores the crowd. He's watching the reflections. He's scanning the storefronts."
Buck followed her gaze, and a slow, appreciative smile spread across his face. "Checking your six without turning your head. That classic."
"It's what you told me to do at the Rustwell,"
she said, a flicker of pride in her voice.
"You said never to trust an empty corner."
Her quick thinking saved them. Moments later, a squad of heavily armed mercenaries, their armor bearing the Argent insignia, swept down the street, questioning the very same guard. He pointed in the opposite direction, and the squad moved on. They had been seconds away from walking straight into a trap. Buck looked at Kasumi with newfound respect. "Okay, boss, we do it your way, but we do it my way too. We find your comm station, but we secure our escape route first." Mehron's net was tightening. They couldn't stay in one place for long. Every face in the crowd felt like a potential enemy. Every public terminal a potential trap. They moved through the underbelly of Port Sion, a desperate flight through crowded markets pungent with alien spices and shadowy maintenance corridors that hummed with the city's machinery. Eventually, they tracked a secure, long-range subspace transmitter to the main docking bay complex, a cavernous structure large enough to house capital ships. It was also crawling with Argent agents. The chase was inevitable. A spotter saw them. A shout went up, and the market dissolved into chaos. Plasma bolts seared the air. They ran, weaving through panicked crowds and overturned stalls.
"This way!"
Kasumi yelled, taking the lead. She ran not with panic, but with purpose. She led them straight towards a Port Authority security checkpoint. As Mehron's mercenaries closed in behind them, Kasumi spun around, raised her hands, and shouted,
"Help! Security! These men are impersonating corporate officers! They're trying to abduct a Concordat ambassador!"
The port security guards, bored and officious, were suddenly faced with a diplomatic incident. Their bodies stiffened, their hands moved instinctively towards their sidearms, and their voices took on the clipped, authoritative tone drilled into them at the academy. They moved to intercept Mehron's team, demanding credentials, authorizations, creating a bureaucratic wall that was, for once, useful. It wouldn't hold them for long, but it bought them time.
"Bay 97,
Torque gasped, pointing with a trembling finger.
"That freighter, the stray dog, its power signature is fluctuating. Its ignition sequence is probably a mess. I can get us in."
It was their only chance. While Buck laid down covering fire, his plasma rifle spitting blue energy back at the confused mercenaries, Torque sprinted for the ship's ramp. He ripped a panel off the control console, his hands a blur as he bypassed security locks and hotwired the activation sequence. Kasumi and Beeves were right behind him, scrambling up the ramp.
"Riley, let's go!"
Kasumi screamed from the top. Buck fired one last volley, then turned and sprinted, diving through the closing entryway just as the ramp sealed shut. Moments later, the ship's engines roared to life with a shudder that vibrated through the entire deck. They blasted off, leaving the chaos of the docking bay and Mehron's approaching gunship behind them. In the quiet hum of deep space, aboard the grimy rust bucket freighter they had stolen, they finally had a moment to breathe. The stray dog smelled of superheated circuits, spilled lubricant, and desperation. It was perfect. They were exhausted, battered, bruised, but alive. More than alive. They were a unit. Buck stood on the small bridge, watching the starfield slide by. Beeves was asleep in a crew bunk. Torque was lovingly tinkering with the ship's ancient navigation computer, coaxing it back to full functionality. He heard footsteps and turned. Kasumi stood there, her silver robes torn and stained, her hair a mess. She had never looked more regal. She held out a data slate.
The ship's registry lists its owner as a defunct shipping guild,
she said.
Legally, it's salvage. It's ours.
She took a breath.
Your contract was to guide us to the Skarath outpost. That contract is null and void.
Buck grunted. Figured as much.
I am offering you a new one,
she continued, her voice formal but lacking its earlier condescension.
As Chief of Security for my delegation, your pay will be quadrupled. Your authority in matters of tactical security will be absolute.
She offered him the data slate. On the screen, everything she had. The complete, unredacted file on the Argent conglomerate's illegal operations, their political connections, their secret assets. It was a declaration of war, and she was inviting him to enlist. He was no longer just hired help to be dismissed. He was a partner. Buck looked from the slate to her face, now set with an unyielding resolve. He saw the fire in her eyes, the steel in her spine. This was a different woman from the one he'd met a few days ago. He'd taught her how to survive. In return, she was offering him a reason to fight. He took the slate, his rough, calloused fingers brushing against hers. He didn't read the fine print. He just gave her a simple, solemn nod. The contract was accepted. They learned about the meeting while hiding in a hollowed-out asteroid in an unregistered mining belt. Torque, using the stray dog's surprisingly robust long-range sensors, had intercepted a coded Argent transmission. The entire board of directors, along with their key Concordat conspirators, were holding a secret summit. The location? Tethys, a gas giant moon famous for its colossal, continent-sized hypercyclones. They were meeting in a shielded, mobile facility designed to ride out the storms. It was impregnable. "We're outgunned and outclassed," Buck said, studying the schematics Torque had pulled up. Mayron's command ship, the Retribution, was a state-of-the-art military cruiser. The stray dog was a garbage scow with guns. "We can't fight his fleet head-on."
A direct assault is illogical,
Kasumi agreed.
We need a different approach, a way to get the data out without engaging them directly.
Beeves was scrolling through the planetary data for Tethys.
"Fascinating. The atmospheric pressure and electrical potential within these cyclones are off the charts. The megafauna here have evolved incredible biological defenses to cope."
He brought up a holographic image of one of the moon's native creatures. It was another Leviathan, but it made the one from Skarath look like a tadpole. The Tethian apex Leviathan was a true behemoth, an airborne creature that spent its entire life cycle within the violent storms, its body a fortress of hyper-dense bone and bioceramic plating. Buck stared at the image. He looked at the storm data. He looked at the schematic of the creature's anatomy. Then, a wild, dangerous look crept into his eyes. A grin, the kind of grin that promised spectacular violence and terrible decisions, spread across his face. "I've got a terrible idea," he said, his voice full of glee. "We're not going to attack their fortress. We're going to build our own." Kasumi was at the helm of the stray dog.
"It's banking left,"
she announced, her eyes fixed on their quarry. a massive shadow moving within the swirling, violent clouds of the hypercyclone.
It's anticipating our trajectory. A classic brass negotiation tactic. Present an obvious threat to force your opponent into a predetermined concession. Predictable.
Her voice was calm, analytical.
I'll counter with an aethel gambit. We feint right.
She maneuvered the ship with an instinct born from years of outwitting political rivals in high-stakes debates. She was predicting the Leviathan's movements, baiting it, cornering it as if it were a rival diplomat she was maneuvering into a political trap.
Target the nexus of the nerve ganglia, just behind the dorsal ridge.
Beeves called out from his science station, his face lit by the glow of an anatomical diagram.
Its hide is too thick for our weapons, but a focused sonic burst there should induce temporary synaptic paralysis.
Torque, you heard the professor?
Buck yelled from engineering.
Give it everything you've got!
Overloading the forward sonic emitters.
Torque shouted back, sweat beading on his brow.
Diverting all non-essential power. If this doesn't work, we'll be lucky if the lights stay on.
Kasumi brought the stray dog around in a tight, gut-wrenching turn, placing them directly above the creature.
Now, Torque!
A high-frequency blast, invisible but powerful, shot from the ship. The Leviathan below shuddered, its movements becoming erratic and clumsy. It was their window.
Buck, it's all you!
Kasumi commanded.
On it, boss!
He slammed his hand down on a large red button. He jury-rigged the ship's industrial landing gear, reinforcing the heavy magnetic clamps and overriding the safety regulators. With a deafening clang, the massive metal pylons shot downwards, not as landing struts, but as colossal pistons. The central pylon, sharpened and reinforced, struck the disoriented Leviathan at the precise spot Beeves had indicated. It was a crushing, surgical, killing blow. The mighty creature went limp, its immense body beginning a slow, silent fall into the stormy depths below. Buck engaged the magnetic clamps. The stray dog groaned under the strain, but the clamps held. They had their beast. This victory belonged to them all. The hypercyclone was hours away, a swirling wall of destruction on the horizon. They had to work fast. Using the ship's plasma cutters and the heavy cargo crane, they began to hollow out the gargantuan carcass, which they'd dragged to a relatively stable rock spire that jutted out above the storm clouds. The scene was one of frantic, organized chaos. Buck directed the operation like a seasoned foreman, shouting orders over the rising wind.
Kasumi, use the crane to pull that rib section clear. We need a firing port there. Beeves, map the thickest bone structures. We'll reinforce those points. Torque, get the ship's cannons unbolted. We're mounting them on the spine.
They worked as one. Torque stripped hull plating from the less critical sections of the stray dog, using it to reinforce the inside of the Leviathan's massive rib cage. Kasumi, demonstrating a surprising aptitude for heavy machinery, operated the cargo crane with delicate mastery. Beeves, covered in gore, moved through the carcass, marking load-bearing bones with a grease pencil. They mounted the ship's salvaged cannons onto the beast's exterior, turning its ribcage into a series of gun emplacements. They ran power conduits through hollowed-out arteries and wired the stray dog's comm system into the echo chamber of the Leviathan's hollowed-out skull. As the first tendrils of the storm began to lash at their perch, they sealed themselves inside. They had built a fortress made of bone and grim purpose. Buck looked around at their handiwork, a grimly satisfied smile on his face. Fort Kick-Ass was now operational. Mayron's fleet arrived just as the hypercyclone hit. They emerged from hyperspace into a maelstrom. The smaller escort ships in his fleet were torn apart instantly, ripped to shreds by the gravitational shearing and winds that moved faster than sound. Only his command ship, the The Retribution was powerful enough to maintain its position. He didn't hesitate. Armored drop pods, shielded against the storm, launched from his ship, streaking down towards the monstrous carcass perched on the rock spire. Mayron was sending in his ground troops. The final battle began. Plasma fire lit up the stormy darkness as Mayron's elite Drakkar enforcers assaulted the bone bunker. Buck and Kasumi manned the salvaged cannons, firing into the swarming figures below. Beeves acted as their spotter, calling out targets from the skull's eye socket. The bunker shuddered under the impact of enemy fire. A hull plate buckled.
"They're trying to breach the sternum!"
Beeves yelled. Suddenly, Torque screamed, not in fear, but in triumph.
"I've got it! I have a monumentally stupid, probably fatal idea!"
"I'm a fan of those!"
Buck shouted back, firing another blast that sent 2 Drakkar soldiers spiraling into the abyss.
"Talk to me, T!"
"A standard broadcast is useless, but this is a brute force data injection,"
Torque explained, his fingers a blur across his console.
"The cyclone is generating terawatts of raw atmospheric energy. I can't punch a signal through it, but I might be able to ride it. I'm using the planet's magnetosphere as a colossal organic capacitor."
He was jury-rigging their comms array to the stray dog's main capacitor banks, which he'd hauled inside.
"The data package is too large for a standard broadcast, but if I can time it with a major lightning strike, a discharge of several million volts, I can use the strike itself as the carrier wave. I can upload the entire package in a single, compressed, high-energy burst that will rip through any jamming." "How much time?"
Kasumi demanded, her face illuminated by the green glow of the targeting screen.
"I need a direct strike on our comms antenna. I need to build the charge. Minutes, maybe more."
Torque yelled back. Buck looked at Kasumi.
"Boss, buy him some time."
She didn't need to be told. She fired with a cold, focused fury, her shots deadly. Together they held the line, a desperate defense against the relentless assault. The bone bunker groaned and cracked around them, but it held.
"Charge is at 90%!
Torque screamed.
"I need the spike! Come on, you beautiful, violent vortex! Give it to me!"
As if on cue, the sky above them turned pure white. A colossal bolt of lightning, wider than their ship, arced down from the heavens, striking the rock spire near them. The secondary forks hit their antenna.
"Now!"
The world went white. Every system overloaded. Torque slammed the broadcast key, and for a single, brilliant moment, their bone bunker became the most powerful transmitter in the sector, screaming Kasumi's evidence into the star-dusted emptiness between worlds on a chariot of lightning. When the storm finally broke, so had Mayron's assault. The data burst had been received. Before Mayron could even process what had happened, a Concordat loyalist fleet, alerted and mobilized by the explosive revelations, jumped into the system, their weapons hot. The Retribution, damaged by the storm and caught completely by surprise, surrendered without firing a shot. Days later, on the capital world of the Galactic Concordat, its towering structures of white alloy and glass catching the light of its sun, the story of the Skarath survivors was legend. The testimony of Ambassador Kasumi and her team, supported by irrefutable data, dismantled the Argent conglomerate. Its board was arrested, its assets seized, its corrupt political allies exposed and disgraced. The final scene of their ordeal played out not in a grimy freighter or a bone fortress, but on the pristine marble balcony of Kasumi's new, luxurious office overlooking the capital city. She was now one of the most powerful and respected figures in the reformed Concordat. Beeves was heading a new xenoanthropological department, and Torque was given an entire R&D division with an unlimited budget, which he complained was almost adequate. Buck was leaning over a small, portable thermal heater he'd brought with him, a piece of purplish meat sizzling on its grill. The aroma was rich and strange. He speared a piece with the tip of his knife and held it out to Kasumi.
"Dinner is served, boss."
She looked at the meat, then at him. He knew what it was. A piece of the Tethian apex leviathan he'd managed to freeze and bring back with them. A souvenir. She hesitated for only a second. Then, the newly appointed High Counselor of the Galactic Concordat, the woman who once recoiled at the thought of a dirty carcass, took the piece of roasted monster meat from the human survivalist and ate it. The meat was dense and rich, with a flavor somewhere between grilled game and salty ocean air. It was the taste of survival. Buck grinned.
"Told you it was edible."
Nadalia Kasumi looked at him, at the man who had dragged her through hell and shown her what she was truly made of. And for the first time, not out of victory or relief, but out of genuine, hard-won camaraderie, she smiled back.